It's this group that brings you recording now. It's this Southeast Queensland branch of the ASC that brings you these Tuesday Telltale sessions, which focus in on the psychom stories of our Queensland members. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today. I'm in Meanjin, and I would like to pay my respects to the Jagera and Turrbal people and their elders, both past and present. While this is our last Tuesday Telltales of the year, we are planning a science trivia night for mid-December in West End, so please keep an eye on our Facebook page for more details as we get closer. And I'd also like to remind people that the ASC national body is holding its inaugural Honours and Masters Research Symposium. That's tomorrow afternoon from 4 p.m. Head to their website for more information if you're interested in attending the symposium, and it'll be followed by a careers night. So today we have Jenni Metcalfe, Director of Econet Communication, chatting with Samantha Vilkins, Postdoctoral Research Associate at QUT, for our latest Tuesday Telltale. I'll hand straight over to Jenni now to better introduce them and start the session. Thanks, Jenni.
Thank you very much, Melina. It's lovely to be here. And welcome to, so far we have, other than Melina and Michelle, we have two participants here today, Tara and Artie. Apparently a number of other people couldn't make it, which is why this recording is so important. But Artie and Tara, no pressure. We will be asking for questions. So if you've got questions, we'd love to have them. And Michelle and Melina will also add to that. So be aware that although we don't have a huge crowd at the moment, there'll be lots of people who will be downloading and watching this on our Facebook site. I'd like to welcome to Tuesday Telltales, Sam Vilkins. Welcome, Sam. If we could add Sam to the spotlight. Haha, there she is.
Hello, hello.
Hi, Sam. Now, we are both in Southeast Queensland at the moment. You're in Brisbane and I'm on North Stradbroke Island or Quad Nabucco country. So we're all part of that southeast part of the world. And I believe that you were born, I don't know if you're born, but you certainly have lived in Brisbane, and Brisbane is home, despite a bit of a sojourn in the national capital, Canberra. Is that right?
Yes, I was born here. South Brisbane,
you were born
here? Yes.
Okay, you were born here. I'll ask you about why you came back shortly from Canberra. I thought that's where all the action was, in psychom anyway. But before I do, I also noticed on your CV that you have a Latvian passport, which means that you can go and live in my favourite place, like Italy, for a while without having to worry about a visa. Is that right?
Yes, that's essentially why I have it as well.
So how were you able to get a Latvian passport? Is this one of your parents or?
Yes, so it's one of those sort of very long stories that I don't know the most interesting bit of it because it was buried under a lot of bureaucracy. But my dad's dad was born in Latvia. My mum's dad was born in Syria. So when they sort of did this thing of all sort of cultural cringe Australians trying to get their kids different citizenships, obviously Latvian, a lot easier to get than Syria or Lebanese, but we know a lot more of our Lebanese family. We know no one from Latvia. But a few years ago, my dad started looking into his family and finding people because his father died quite young. And Latvia, big on new citizens, loves new citizens. If you ever had to, if you had ancestors who had to leave the country for the draft or the war or anything, they'll immediately sort of sign you up as a citizen. So we all got it done. I've never been to Latvia. My dad's now been, but I voted in the last national election because you can vote from here. It was very fun. Learned a lot about the country. Yeah, it's really, really exciting to be part of that sort of culture, even though I've not yet been able to go, but I would love to.
Well, I think that you're in one person, a symbol of the melting pot of multiculturalism that is Australia. And I think really is what makes for such an interesting mix of not just our what we do in Australia, but also the science that we do in Australia. Now, I should say what your current position is. Sam is Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Digital Media Research Centre at the Queensland University of Technology. So I feel like I should call you doctor because you're postdoctoral research associate.
Not yet.
But when I saw your CV, I saw there was no finish date on the PhD.
Yes.
So are you an imposter?
Let it be known that you don't need to do everything by the book, apparently, as I keep discovering. I should be finished my PhD. I certainly started about 4 or 5 years ago or something. I was ill at the start of the year, still finishing my PhD, applied for the postdoc. Some places, I think I applied to somewhere else that was quite specific about you can't step foot here until you've finished. QT was very understanding and said you can start whenever, we'd love you to start. Finish it off. So I'm still finishing off edits and things, and I'll submit. So I'm not technically a doctor yet, and I'm sort of technically a postdoc researcher and also not, but you know, apparently that's all fine.
As long as you don't want to change jobs, I guess. Otherwise it could
No,
get
I do need, I did, they said that's all fine, but you do need to be committed to finishing the doctorate. I said, yes, definitely.
Well, it sounds like you're not far away. And of course, they must have wanted you to give you that position without having that little bit of paper. But I want to go back in time a little bit to younger Sam in Queensland, finished high school, goes to the University of Queensland and does a bachelor in mathematics and computing. So were you like a nerd? Is that...
Yes, there's a specific, so I went to do a Bachelor of Science because science was the easiest thing I could imagine studying.
Science was the easiest thing you could imagine studying. I'm sorry?
Yeah. You know how it is.
What makes you think that it's the easiest thing you could study?
Oh, well, it was just the easiest thing in high school. I did much worse in English and other things. So I thought I'll keep doing this. But my favorite subject was physics, and I was going to major in physics. And there's a subject in first year physics, at least at the University of Queensland, which is essentially first semester, they ask you questions like, if you move a cardboard box, will it keep moving? Like questions that you know how to answer from being a human being for a certain number of years in the world. Sort of, will things slowly speed down if there's friction? Like, and then semester 2, they start asking you about quantum physics. And all of a sudden the grades crash, everyone hates it, and etc. And I was one of the many people who dropped off of physics at that point because it was just suddenly far too much to contemplate. And I decided to major in maths instead, because a physics class is about 7 hours of contact a week, all labs in person. And a maths class is about 3 hours a week, and you don't need to be there. So a lot of it was practicalities. I also just liked maths more. It's very interesting to me. I still sort of miss doing math problems, even though I wasn't exceptionally great at them. But yeah,
so what is it about maths that you find intriguing? I'm sorry, it wasn't well, I did okay at it, and I found calculus somewhat intriguing. But
calculus is very intriguing. I would agree. My best
I said
subject...
intriguing. I didn't say fascinating.
My best subject in high school was actually, my best subject was maths and my worst subject was maths. Like there was 2 different maths classes and they were just completely separated. The sort of maths I liked the most was discrete mathematics, which is sort of all the sort of systems thinking, drawing, they're called graphs, but sort of drawing shapes and thinking how many colors are needed to fill in the shape, how many, like what's the minimum number of lines you can draw from point to point, all those sort of puzzles. I really enjoy those sort of puzzles compared to, I never did a course in financial maths. I never did optimization, all those sort of things. I just couldn't stomach, but I can do all the little problems and proofs and philosophy and logic. I really like those sort of things.
Philosophy, maths, not so sure about that. But anyway, you graduated from
I did.
University of Queensland, and then not long after you went to Canberra to do psychom. Why? So what was it that made you move away from the fascination of maths to psychom?
So I did originally sort of think to do science communication in high school. I was thinking of even coming down to Canberra to do it. It was the only place I could sort of see that I would like to do it. And then
Hey, just stop there for a second. You said you thought about doing it in high school?
yeah.
Most people don't in high school don't even know what science communication is.
So
what got your interest in high school?
So I had a very, very good physics teacher, and we had a little book club of sort of pop science books. I don't know any specific examples, but all the like The Disappearing Spoon was, I think, one of them. All those sort of famous books about scientists or theories or different inventions and things like that. And I would just devour them all through year 12. And so I thought, oh, I'd really like to write about science. And I was also really interested in, again, philosophy of science and those sort of areas. And I thought, oh, I should do this for my undergraduate. There's somewhere in Canberra that'll let me do it. I'll probably get the grades I can get in there. And then one teacher said, don't do that. Go and do a science degree first, and you can learn all this stuff later, which I don't know on the level of advice. And the other thing was just sort of didn't want to move in the end, wanted to stay in Brisbane, decided to just stay and study maths. But it meant that when I finished the degree, I did 3 interviews for internships to do with maths. So they were all sort of software startups. One was for train ticketing, logistics.
Train ticketing.
Yeah, they were all sort of weird software, sort of walked in, there's like a ping pong table and everyone's sort of cool in Brisbane. But every single one of them, I just bombed the interview. They asked me really technical coding questions and I just panicked. I didn't like the environment. I thought, I can't do this. I'm not good at math. I can't do this under pressure. And then just applied for the masters in the thing that I wanted to do originally, like 3 years ago, and got to go down to Canberra to do it. And it was just everything I sort of had wanted to study, but probably also couldn't wrap my head around at 17, 18. So it was probably the better timing in the end. But yeah, also the sort of questions I had, which were all about, at that point, more to do with politics and science policy and those sort of areas, Canberra seemed like the natural place to go.
So are you a Questacon Science Circus kid?
No, I'm not. Probably should have been, but just it was never what I did. I did the other masters, as they call it.
All right. And your other masters was about statistics and policy. Is that right?
Yes. So, the PhD is more about statistics than the masters is. Masters was sort of about what citations different government departments were, like what references they were using for different things. Yes. With the argument being that government papers don't cite any research, don't have any engagement with it. And actually it turns out that they do cite a whole bunch of research, especially the Department of Health. Everything the Department of Health puts out has like 40% academic citations or whatever on it, which is
interesting.
Nice to see. Yeah.
Yeah. What about the Department of Environment or the Department of Climate Change?
I think it was lower, but the weirdest finding, or like, yeah, the most surprising finding was just how hard it was to even find the documents. Like I don't think I included the Department of Industry because I couldn't find any record of the publications that they put up. It was just that difficult.
Okay, so you finished your masters, and instead of doing what you thought about in high school, like writing about science or maths or whatever, you decided to do a PhD. Why?
So in the interim time, turns out I'm not very good at writing, or at least I struggle with it a lot. And I was far more interested in sort of research questions, or at least less research questions, but sort of the art of research. I really like finding out answers and sort of congealing together information. And the lifestyle of a PhD appealed to me a lot. I really like sort of sitting around reading books and researching more than high pressure writing. So yeah, I had the opportunity to stick around on a scholarship. So.
Okay, and did it deliver? Did it deliver the sort of stimulation that you wanted?
Oh, absolutely. I had a really excellent PhD time, which is probably why I'm still doing it and it got so delayed. I took sort of every opportunity to teach and to travel, and I got sent to Singapore and New Zealand, and I went to you know, Boston and Harvard all within my PhD time. So that was fantastic. At least met all sorts of wonderful people across the world and talked about millions of ideas and philosophies all over the place.
So your PhD, I think, is on the dynamics and drivers, or this might be your research now.
Yes, yeah,
Your research,
sounds like it.
So your PhD, tell us a bit about that. You looked at statistics in politics and how they use statistics, I think.
Yes, so
Yeah.
in a practical sense, which might also sort of appeal to the sort of science communicator audience, I spoke to about 50 different people involved in public statistics in Australia. So that was broken down into about 10 academics, about 10 public servants, 10 sort of journalists or editors. How many have I counted? 10 sort of consultants and analysts of, yeah, sort of secondary analysts, and then another 10 politicians and staffers. And the questions were all about, where do you get your statistics? When you go to find a statistic, do you check it in any way? Is it all gut instinct, whether it's wrong or not? How do you sense if it's wrong? What would you do if you thought it was wrong? All those sort of heuristic thinking. How do you communicate uncertainty or error? Do you include that? What sort of things do you keep in mind about audience? How do you communicate this, and this? And then a question about general pet peeves and what they hate about statistics in Australia, which was very productive and sort of comes to a very complicated PhD conclusion about the role of interpretation in statistics and how much everyone sort of lets statistics speak for themselves, but they're highly interpretational and biased for the situations they're in.
So did anything surprise you in what you found by interviewing all these people?
After a few years in it, nothing sort of, even the things that surprise you, you're so in deep in it that you can't really have that perspective. It was interesting how many people sort of admitted to like flying by the seat of their pants, have no idea what's going on, just that sort of stuff. A lot of the journalists and politicians were perfectly happy to be on the record under their full names and say things like, what was it? I have this big quote that I use at the start of all my PowerPoints because it says, morality is good, but numbers are better. One of the journalists was just like, oh, it's just easier to use numbers. All the quotes just about, oh, we just make up statistics. It doesn't really matter if they're like any good or not. And they just say these things like, sure, like, I'll write this down. But it's because, and this was sort of a separate finding, that there's just different ideas about the point of statistics, sort of across this spectrum of different people, that some of the academics or statisticians have this real innate sense of, oh, but why wouldn't you have every piece of information because they need to be true? Whereas equally valid almost, some of the staffers and politicians have this more rhetorical understanding that, oh, well, when someone sees 90% of public schools are underfunded, they don't actually think it must be exactly that number. They just think, I need to think about this issue more. It's all rhetorical sort of messaging. So that was interesting, though, how much they admit to making things up.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, Tara suggested that you use that thing about morality or numbers
I
as
love
a title,
it. So
a title
funny.
for a book. I think that would be fabulous, or at least a good article in the conversation. A question that has come to me on text via a colleague of yours, Dr. Michelle Redlinger, it says, do you think science communication is political communication? Do you think there are links to that? It's certainly
an excellent question.
Certainly an issue that I've been thinking about a lot, particularly in the space of climate change communication. But yeah, what are your thoughts about science and political communication?
I think it is. I think there's a lot of different ways sort of define political communication, in the sense of, well, is it for a specific political end? Is it within the bounds of a sort of defined political issue and election, or is it just a statement that has sort of political implications? If you're even just talking about things which some people might think are apolitical, they can be tied to a lot of other things. You might be thinking you're doing a puff piece about a nice local mammal, but actually that's tied into a whole bunch of funding issues about the local wildlife and things like that. So almost certainly always sort of political. And even if something's been construed as non-political, it's because of a lot of what do they call them, sort of involved interests to make it that way is sort of, especially what I found out with statistics. There's a lot of work behind what statistics are published regularly without question. And they're sort of seen as neutral statistics, whereas they're sort of huge icebergs of other questions. That came up a lot.
Did any of your interviewees use statistics, the same statistics, differently?
Yes, and in different sort of ways. So some of them use them differently in a sort of admittance of sometimes I use them to say different things. Some of the staffers sort of knew that they had to do that. Some of the advocates, I think one of the climate change advocates said that he described in really great detail how he uses the same information to communicate on Facebook or on Twitter or to politicians or to like his kids. That was really interesting, just how to use that different information to different levels and how much specificity you need. So there was a lot of that, but a lot of it, some of them sort of knew to change that, but didn't really acknowledge how it would be interpreted differently to different levels of, I think some people said, oh, I leave off all the uncertainty information because no one really understands it without thinking about what that might end up meaning. But a lot of people had a keen idea of different contexts they were working with.
So they would use the same statistic in a different way in different contexts.
Mm.
Tara asked the question in the chat, which is there what's an example of a neutral statistic, and what kind of rhetorical power does that neutrality then give that statistic? What does it bestow?
That's a great question. Thank you, Tara. I think one of the clearest examples people usually pick up, not because it's particularly neutral, but it is easy to understand in a way, is that something like population is a really common statistic. And you think, oh, that's just how many people who are there. It's the population. That's a thing I understand. But then when you actually start thinking about how complex the calculation of population is, you think even questions about census night has to be where you are that night and not where you were the last night. Even if you're away, you have to be honest about where you're away or the calculation's off. But then also things about, well, are we counting citizens? Are we just counting people who are physically here? Who gets to count in the population? All of those sort of things. But another one on the side of rhetorical power and neutrality is you might remember from a few years ago, and especially during COVID, the arguments about unemployment statistics and the fact that there's technically a lot of ways to calculate unemployment. You can count a lot of different things. One of the huge ones is that the official count, as long as you're employed 1 hour a week, you're employed, which people argue about, obviously, especially now that we have more casual workers and part-time workers. Some people say that it should be calculated differently. But the point is that the international system uses this definition so that all the countries can compare. So even if you think it should be different, there's the argument that we should keep it the same so that we have this comparison with other countries and with ourselves into the past. But then because this is the neutral statistic, you have to take it sort of as fact, as reality. Whatever the ABS says is the unemployment, even if it's not true.
Well, politicians certainly take it that way. Yes, absolutely.
Because the ABS says it. Whereas then you could get people from all sort of sides, from the right and the left, making public attacks to say the government is lying. Actually, unemployment is much, much higher or much, much lower. And they have this sort of power because it's so disruptive to claim that it's different, which is really interesting because they're all making claims about what's true, even though they're all using sort of wildly different definitions. So there's a lot of those sort of stories.
I think that whole nexus of statistics certainly came through in COVID reports and updates as well. I think we were drowning in statistics in the end and we weren't always told what they actually really meant in terms of that interpretation. And I think that's certainly a challenge for science communication. I wanted to go, and I would invite other people to put questions in the chat. I'm very happy to take any questions you have. But I wanted to go back to what made you decide to move from Canberra back to Brisbane and apply for a job at QUT, Queensland University of Technology.
Great question. So part of it was that I missed Brisbane and thought I
Of
would give it a
course.
shot to be back home. My family is here. I miss the weather and all that. But specifically, so I had the sort of same concerns as anyone finishing a PhD in these times, whether I would get a job, especially for social sciences, whether I would get a postdoc at all, whether it would be in something that I'd have to study up a lot on and be like something that I maybe wasn't exactly interested in, how long it would take to get one, all those sort of questions. And then just as I was finishing up, I think my third year, this job came up at QT, which is I had my eye on for the whole time, because when I moved down to Canberra was just about when the centre was starting. I think it was started about the same time officially, the Digital Media Research Centre. And as they would tell me now, they are the #1 school university for communications in the country, and something like 20th in the world. They've really shot up and done a lot of work to establish themselves. So this
You think that's
particular
because
project,
Michelle Redlinger joined them?
yes, I'm happy to endorse that. But this project came up with this sort of timing, and it was something that wasn't exactly what I'd been studying. So it's about polarization online, and apart from statistics and politics, one of my other interests has always been digital media and social media, and those sort of dynamics. So being able to continue a project that wasn't exactly what I'd just been, exhausted on from the past years, but something a little different back in my hometown. And it's also, they were hiring, Michelle said that it's 16th in the world. Thank you, Michelle. They were hiring 4
Yeah, let's get
postdocs
the statistics right.
they were hiring 4 postdocs at the same time, which was also really lovely. It's something you don't really get sometimes in social science research, to have a team all together like that. So it's been really, really wonderful to sort of join this big team on this new research project, something that's a bit rarer. And I'm really thrilled that it gets to happen in Brisbane as well.
And you're looking at polarization of online debates. Is this any debates, or is it also about, are you particularly interested in debates that have a science basis to it?
So
yeah.
the project itself is sort of, any political debates. We're sort of looking at elections and climate change and all those sort of things. But then with things like climate change, science communication is sort of a big element of it. And then personally, not so much that they're science topics, but I'm then interested in how information more broadly gets brought into these sort of debates, how people are sharing the hard news articles, or how they're sharing statistics, and that sort of hard knowledge in backing up their points, something which sort of fascinates me, because like you say, that the same statistics gets used by both sides, or sometimes just as strangely sort of seemingly neutral statistics can be avoided by both sides, and they'll come up with their own other facts to use.
So you're looking at any specific examples of debates at the moment? Are there any debates that you're focused on?
The team as a whole is looking at some election cycles. So we're sort of currently in the whole project started in August this year, and it goes for 5 years. So we've got this big outlook, I guess. We've just done a lot of data gathering of topics for the Brazil election and the Danish election. And then specifically, we're looking at probably just how things like floods or fires are reported, and whether they're sort of reported in polarized language. And then, we're probably looking at things like the referendum on the Indigenous Voice Parliament, and sort of flash issues like that.
Well, floods and fire, I think, would be of interest to particularly science communication practitioners, and what sort of polarization is happening there, particularly in the online world. Michelle has Melina, has put a question in chat, and that is the fact that people place so much trust in statistics. How do you think they can be better used, and how might we ensure that people are more aware of the significant potential of misinformation?
Thank you, Melina. This is one of the bigger questions I was grappling with the whole thesis, in terms of there was such professional concern about bad statistics, this sort of fear of bad stats, whether there is a lot of bad statistics out there, or just the professionals are worried about it, one or the other. And the question was sort of, where can we find intervention points to stop this from happening, but we don't really know who's to blame. So part of the thesis was finding out who's to blame. And the sort of suggestions I had, one really interesting one was someone spoke about how much they gatekeep their own work from the public debate and what sort of numbers they'd like to see out in public debate, because they acknowledged, and a lot of different people acknowledge this to various levels of personal responsibility, that as soon as statistics get out there, they get out everywhere. That if you let something get out of your control, you'll see it everywhere on Twitter the next day, or it'll be screenshotted a million times on Facebook, misinterpreted, and just a mess. So one person said, oh, I really, really triple check my work. If I'm called up to be talking head in some sort of media piece, I make sure that everything I'm using is really up to code. But also they said they don't even speak in statistics a lot of the time. They do all this work behind the scenes and then they have a conclusion that they read out that can't really be misinterpreted and can't be misread.
Oh, interesting.
And I think that was really interesting because there's this other push, which is equally as valid a lot of the time, to open science, open data, and those sort of things. And then there's some sort of suggested movements of actually some of this shouldn't really be public, some of it should be behind lock and key. And even the ABS does that. There's some data sets where you have to, you don't really have to prove that much, but you need to say, I'm a researcher with these people, we'd like to answer this question, that's what we'd like to do. And then the ABS gives you the data. So everyone can't make up their own unemployment figure and splash it everywhere. So that sort of regulation, boring answer, but probably the most helpful one.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting when you said some people find it better not to use statistics, but just to give a verbal conclusion, which is fascinating because, yeah, we certainly in science communication often depend on that startling statistic to get people's attention, to get them interested in some sort of science issue. But you mentioned previously about polarized language. What do you mean by polarized language?
So, for example, not so much polarized language at the level of sentences, but we're talking about sort of what whole frame different news articles use. I imagine that science communicators are somewhat familiar with the use of frames in different news articles. We're hoping to do mass analysis of grabbing a whole bunch of newspapers and seeing whether they focus more on economic aspects or political aspects or environmental aspects of, say, flooding. But it could be actual polarized language in the form of, you know, vitriol towards certain groups of people and things like that, or polarized language in the aspect of they don't even talk to a segment of society and that they're fully sort of separated communities. A lot of different bits and pieces of how you define polarized communities, as we're all finding out on the job.
Yeah. Tara has a question in the chat that says, what kind of online forum will you be looking at? And do you think changing between forums, for example, Facebook to Twitter, changes the conversations that people have? And that's an interesting question, given the fact that Twitter's potentially going to change with the change of ownership that we've all been hearing in the news.
We had a long conversation about this yesterday because a lot of our ideas rest on doing Twitter research. And even if Twitter still exists, there's a chance that the data collection methods will just implode on themselves. So definitely we're looking at, we're focused on online platforms. So we're looking at Facebook, Twitter, YouTube's a big one. And it definitely, there's other researchers at the Digital Media Research Centre who focus a lot on that sort of question, like how discussions flow on different sort of platforms. I'm really fascinated by it and sort of how, yeah, the norms of communication and conversation around different places. So I said that some of my interviewees spoke about how they use statistics in different ways. And there was even stuff like, oh, if I'm on LinkedIn, I'll use stats. Like I'll be very short and to the point and I'll use all the data because that's what they really love. But if I'm on Facebook, I'll just be chatty and all that sort of stuff. So there's all those sort of questions about who you know your audience is and how far the information's traveling and all of that.
Which is really about the basics of good science communication, isn't it? Know your audience,
Indeed.
know how to, you know, get that aggregation of interest and engagement in what's going on. I'd just like to ask our participants that are there, Michelle, Melina, Artie, Matt, Tara, if you've got a question, please feel free to turn on your video and your sound and ask that question. We've got a few more minutes before we have to wrap up. But while you're thinking about that, I wanted to ask you, Sam, what's next? You mentioned that you know, you have this passport that means you could go and live in Europe. Do you have ambitions to potentially take your research further?
So I really don't know, actually. So this postdoc, usually postdocs are 2 years, 3 years maybe. This is for 5 years, which is extraordinarily lucky. And I feel a bit lazy in that I'm sort of looking for this next 5 years project and kicking up my feet and slowly building up my research background. I don't really know what I'll plan to do afterwards. I am hoping to, on a completely other note, go and like do research on one hand, and then I have friends who go and help out produce shows at the Edinburgh Fringe and sort of fringe festivals, things like that. So I almost am looking forward to taking a brief break and trying other things for a while before sort of coming back to other academic jobs. So
well, I noticed that while you're in Canberra, you did a bit of a stint on the Wholesome show as a host. With,
indeed, they'll rope in anyone.
Rod Lamberts and Will. And is that something that you're interested in, doing more of that sort of, I guess, performance in science communication?
I can talk, but I much prefer to organize things, I suppose. Yeah, more behind the scenes
I can't
work.
imagine they would have let you host it unless you had some sort of flair for that. Flair for
I'm okay at it. I'm
entertainment.
okay at it.
Okay. Tara asked a question, and she's not going to put a video on because she's walking home at the moment while she's listening to this fascinating conversation. But she has a lovely question, which is, if you could fix one thing about the use of statistics, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. And us listening to it on the way home makes us feel like we're drive time radio or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Fix one thing about statistics, or what the use of statistics. I guess there's a sort of sentiment I come to in the conclusion thesis. Maybe a little complex, but it's just the idea that sort of anyone can do statistics, which is true, but there's all these complex sort of statistical rules that everyone sort of thinks, oh, what's the quote? There's some sort of really useful quote about how you can just because you can do all these things in math doesn't mean it actually applies to the data that you have. All these people doing secondary analysis of data just because, oh, well, you can divide this number by this one, so I've created this new indicator, and then it's meaningless in the actual like underlying data that they had to begin with. You saw a lot of this with whatever they called them, armchair epidemiologists during the start of COVID, just engineers who thought because they understood data, they could just model things. So some sort of respect for the actual difficulty and art of statistics would be helpful. So not really just not a straight statistical literacy remark, but some level of respect for how difficult it is, I suppose.
You're not actually a statistician anymore, though, are you?
I've never been a statistician.
You're a social scientist.
I've done one class on stats in my life.
Oh, okay.
I got a credit on it or something, maybe. So I don't even know how to do statistics at all.
Okay. Melina makes a comment, people can lose touch of the actual data and trends, what they say, which I think is a good point. When we condense all that down in statistics, then they can lose touch of that. And we have a question from Michelle. And after that question, I'm going to ask people who can, that doesn't include you, Tara, because you're still walking and we don't want you to get run over, to turn on their videos and we can have a brief chat before we finish off. But Michelle asks, Do you think the reproducibility crisis changed the way statistics research is thought about and done?
I know less about the reproducibility crisis. I've also seen some people say that it's overblown. I'm not quite sure. It's the reproducibility crisis is about how, mostly in psychology, I think, in sort of similar fields, that they sort of suddenly found out that a bunch of research couldn't be reproduced properly because no one was understanding statistics right. As far as I know, it's not really changed anything. People certainly, anecdotally, I know, aren't taking their statistical consultancy units with any more sort of time and respect at all. People still sort of say, oh, we've got this data now, someone needs to do the stats on it to tell us what it means. And yeah, sort of as far as I know, it was a big flash concern in psychology, but maybe hasn't actually led to a lot of work being redone. And maybe it was overblown. I'm not sure.
I feel like that was a colleague to colleague question. But yes, fascinating stuff that you're doing, and I think it has a lot of implications for the practice of science communication, as well as the ongoing research. So I'm going to actually go back on my word and ask you one more question. What tips would you give to science communicators when they're using statistics in science?
Oh,
what's it? One tip, just one will do.
I heard a really good tip, and the problem is I don't know which way round it was, but you can go and check it up. People talking to journalists and things about stats, they all have really specific rules, which I found really fascinating. And it was things like use fractions when you speak, but don't use them on the radio and things like that. So down to that sort of minutia, ask someone in radio or some expert journalist, and they'll have some sort of idea about exactly how you should say that number to get the message across. The simpler, the better.
I think simplicity is always a good message, but maybe there needs to be a guide for how science communicators use statistics in their communication, which I guess is also part of risk communication.
Oh, yes, very much.
Tara can't put her video on, but Archie and Matt, we would welcome you if you're able to, just to wrap up this session and say goodbye. Michelle can't put her sound on because there's a concrete drill nearby. But hi, Matt, and hi, Tara and Archie, and hello to all those people who will be watching this recording. Thank you so much, Sam, for a really interesting thing. Good luck in your postdoctoral research, as well as finishing off that pesky thesis. I'm sure that it will almost be there, and we'll hear about your graduation soon. So thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing more.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you very
Sam.
much. This is wonderful.